about fascism in an article written for a 1944 issue of St. Anthony's Messenger. A Jesuit priest by the name of Father Robert Southard wrote the following about comics. There is an anti-American dictator propaganda in the glorification of these wrong-writing supermen. If our youth get the notion that it is heroic for a private person to take over in matters of public order, we are ready for Hitler. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the concerns of this relatively conservative Jesuit priest in the 1940s is mirrored by concerns of an indie comics giant. So Art Spiegelman, in a 1995 interview, you all know who Art Spiegelman is? He did Mouse, the only graphic novel to have ever won a Pulitzer Prize. In a 1995 interview, he was asked about the work of Jack Kirby. And he had this to say. He said, "The triumph of the will, the celebration of the physicality of the human body at the expense of the intellect, is very much an impulse in fascist art. It has a lot to do with the motive for Kirby's work, even though I understand that his work is filled with characters who fought against fascists." So do the Catholic Church and comic books really have to be enemies? Is there anything natural to either of them that forces them to be in this contentious relationship? I think a book definition also does is that it allows us to see Catholic churches in a new light. By Scott McCloud's definition, a comic strip hangs in practically every Catholic church in the world. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is the Stations of the Cross in heavy use last Friday. And this is basically, by Scott McCloud's definition, a comic strip. This is juxtaposed images put in deliberate sequence to tell a narrative, to tell the narrative of Jesus' crucifixion. In addition to the Stations of the Cross, there are also other examples. There's this. Before my Rosary comic, there were comics about the Rosary. I'm sure some of you have seen this. This is a pamphlet that explains how to pray the Rosary. And surrounding this image of Our Lady is basically a comic strip. They're all images in deliberate sequence telling a narrative. So using comics to express the Rosary is definitely not a modern invention. This was probably done in the 50s or 60s. Here's a much, much earlier work about the Rosary that shows the mysteries of the Rosary illustrated as images in deliberate sequence. In fact, a lot of the greatest works of art within our church are comics. This is the Sistine Chapel right here. And this is basically a large comic strip, images juxtaposed in deliberate sequence that you have to hurt your neck to see. Go ahead.
Didn't they call...
Point to one thing. They point to the fact that the Catholic Church is a church of comics. It's a church filled to the brim of comics, right? There's a very rich tradition of comics within the Catholic Church. And I think this is especially true. Understanding of the Incarnation has led to a lot of Catholic church buildings becoming the poor man's Bible. In addition to the Stations of the Cross, pretty much every Catholic church in the world has some form of narrative sequential art hanging somewhere, usually in the form of stained glass or paintings or something. What this means is, as Catholics, if our eyes are wandering during the service, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Right? It's not necessarily a bad thing. The Catholic Church is very much into this tradition of using visuals to educate and visuals to communicate, especially still visuals. So that leads me to the conclusion, at least, that maybe the Catholic Church and comic books are buddies after all, if you define comics in a specific way. There's some evidence of this, much more recent in comic book histories. There have been a lot of comics that tackle Catholic subjects head on. So here are some examples. In the 1980s, anybody have these at home? Okay, in the 1980s, Marvel Comics actually published a series of comic book issues talking about Catholic icons. So they did one called Francis, Brother of the Universe, and another one on Mother Teresa, and another one on Pope John Paul II. These are all drawn in that iconic Marvel style. So the stigmata scene in the Francis book actually looks like he's being shot by laser rays. But they're still very thoroughly Catholic. They still tell Catholic stories. In the 1980s, a writer by the name of Kurt Busiek, he's a very, very popular superhero writer who's worked for both Marvel and DC Comics. He's written pretty much every iconic Marvel and DC superhero there is, even Superman and Batman and Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, and Fantastic Four, and the X-Men. In the 1990s, there was a self-publishing movement where a lot of these writers and artists that worked for these big superhero publishers sort of went off on their own. And Kurt Busiek was one of the people who did this. He created his own superhero universe that he documented in a book called Astro City. So Astro City is kind of an anthology. It features different stories about different superheroes in this particular universe. In volume 2 of this story, this is the longest story that he did in the Astro City series. In volume 2, the star of the story is a superhero called the Confessor, who is a priest by day and a superhero by night. And he has a Robin-like sidekick called the Altar Boy that follows him around, who is actually an altar boy by day and the altar boy at night. It's actually a very good story. It's very surprising. It's a very surprising story. My own publisher, Pauline Books and Media, has other comics besides mine now. They have a comic about Padre Pio, and also a comic book about John Paul II. I think these are both translations of Italian comics, but they're also very well done. Using sequential art to educate people. You know, the Catholic Church recognizes the power of the image and the educational power of the image. So by using comics that are well done within our classrooms and in our libraries, we're actually engaging in this age-old tradition within the Catholic Church. So one obvious way of doing this is to encourage students to take in information as sequential images, to get them to read comics and understand how the comic book medium works. So here are some suggestions that I have.